Nathaniel Brooks adjusted the brim of his weathered fedora as he stepped into the cabin of Flight 728. At 72, his movements were deliberate, each step a quiet negotiation with time. His worn leather carry-on brushed against his leg, its surface polished by years of faithful service. To an observer, he might have appeared as any other elderly traveler, perhaps a grandfather on his way to visit family. But there was a particular dignity about Mr. Brooks, one that came from decades of enduring the world's silent judgments with grace. The flight attendants smiled brightly as passengers filed in, their voices polite but distant. Nathaniel noticed, as he always did, how some smiles lingered longer than others, how pleasantries extended a touch further for certain travelers. He didn't dwell on it. He had learned long ago to let such observations pass like the wind brushing against his cheek, acknowledged, but not embraced. He found his seat, 24B, and settled in, smoothing his slacks and tucking his hat carefully under the seat in front of him. Across the aisle, a young woman with auburn hair and a curious energy watched the boarding process. She seemed thoughtful, not one for scrolling through her phone or thumbing through a magazine. When her eyes met Nathaniel's, she offered a warm smile, which he returned with a nod. "Traveling far?" she asked, her voice light and friendly. "Washington, D.C., he replied, his voice rich and steady. "Visiting my nephew. It's been a while since we've seen each other." She nodded approvingly. "Family's important." Nathaniel agreed with a quiet hum and looked away, allowing the conversation to rest. He didn't mind brief exchanges, but he cherished the silence that followed even more. As the last passengers boarded, the hum of engines deepened, blending with the faint rustling of overhead bins and murmured conversations. Nathaniel adjusted his seatbelt, his movements methodical, his face calm. The seat beside him remained empty for now, offering a pocket of solitude amid the bustling cabin. The attendants began their pre-flight checks, walking briskly down the aisle with a practiced efficiency. Nathaniel observed them out of habit, not expectation, his gaze steady but detached. He noticed how they greeted passengers, their tones fluctuating subtly depending on who they addressed. It was a small thing, the kind of nuance many would overlook. But not Nathaniel. He had lived long enough to recognize the unspoken hierarchies that followed him everywhere. The engines roared to life, and the plane pushed back from the gate. Nathaniel leaned his head back, closing his eyes as the faint vibrations of the taxiing plane coursed through the cabin. He let his thoughts drift, focusing on the reunion ahead. His nephew, a professor at Howard University, had insisted he come for a visit. "You've earned a break, Uncle Nate," he'd said over the phone. "It's time you let someone take care of you for a change." The words had touched Nathaniel, though he hadn't said so. His life had been one of quiet endurance, of taking care of others, not the other way around. Still, he had agreed, and now, here he was, on his way. As the plane lifted off, Nathaniel opened his eyes, gazing out at the receding earth. There was something humbling about watching the world shrink, its vastness reduced to patches of green and gray. He sighed softly, a sound almost swallowed by the hum of the engines. The flight attendants began moving through the cabin, their carts rattling softly as they dispensed drinks and snacks. Nathaniel waited patiently, his hands resting lightly on his lap. He wasn't thirsty yet, but he knew he'd ask for water when they reached him. It was a simple request, one he'd made countless times before. As the cart drew closer, Nathaniel couldn't help but notice the ease with which the attendants served the other passengers. Their smiles brighter, their voices warmer. It wasn't anything overt, just a pattern, subtle but distinct. He glanced at the young woman across the aisle, who was now watching the service as well, her expression thoughtful. Nathaniel shifted in his seat, preparing to ask for his drink when the time came. It was just water, after all, a small thing, nothing worth fussing over, or so he thought. Nathaniel Brooks sat quietly as the flight attendant's cart approached, his hands folded neatly on his lap. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and constant, a backdrop to the faint clinking of ice cubes and the rustling of snack bags. He glanced at the attendant, a young woman with a practiced smile, as she handed a can of ginger ale to the man seated ahead of him. Her movements were smooth, almost automatic, as though she'd performed this task countless times before. When she reached Nathaniel's row, her smile faltered, not enough to be obvious, but enough for him to notice. He had a way of catching such things. The tiny shifts in demeanor that others might dismiss as insignificant. He waited until she looked his way, her pen poised over her notepad. "May I have a glass of water, please?" His voice was polite, even. The attendant hesitated, just for a moment, before nodding. "Of course," she said, though her tone lacked the same warmth she'd offered others. She moved the cart forward, tending to the rows behind him. Nathaniel assumed she would return shortly with his water. It was a simple request, and he had no reason to think otherwise. But as the minutes stretched on, the water never came. Across the aisle, Sarah Miller noticed the interaction. She had been observing the service since it began, her attention drawn not by any overt slight but by a sense of something unspoken. There was a rhythm to the way the attendants moved through the cabin, a certain pattern to how they engaged with passengers. And then there was Mr. Brooks, who seemed to be waiting longer than anyone else. She shifted in her seat, unsure whether to say something. It wasn't her place. After all, perhaps it had been an oversight. A simple mistake. The attendant was busy, and the cabin was full. Surely, she would return soon. Nathaniel, for his part, sat without complaint. He glanced out the window, his expression calm, though his fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. He had learned, over the years, that patience often served him better than protest. Still, there was a familiar heaviness to the moment, a quiet reminder of the unspoken rules that seemed to govern interactions like these. He sighed softly, barely audible over the drone of the engines. The cart made its way back up the aisle, the attendant now collecting trash and empty cups. Nathaniel caught her eye as she passed, offering a gentle reminder. "Excuse me," he said, his tone unchanged. "I had asked for some water earlier." The attendant blinked, as though she had forgotten entirely. "Oh, right," she said quickly. "I'll get that for you." Her words were hurried, and she didn't meet his gaze. Again, she moved on without delivering the water. Sarah frowned. She couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something deliberate about the way the request had been overlooked, not overtly hostile, but deliberate all the same. She looked at Nathaniel, who now sat back in his seat, his face impassive. He didn't seem surprised, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. The cart disappeared toward the front of the cabin, and the routine of the flight continued. Nathaniel closed his eyes, leaning his head back as if to rest. But Sarah could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders remained slightly stiff. She turned her attention to the flight attendant, who was now chatting with another passenger near the galley. The ease with which she laughed and exchanged pleasantries only deepened Sarah's unease. It wasn't just the forgotten water. It was the indifference, the casual dismissal that carried a weight far heavier than the gesture itself. Nathaniel opened his eyes and glanced at Sarah, as though sensing her gaze. He offered a small, reassuring smile, as if to say it was fine, that it wasn't worth making a fuss. But Sarah felt the knot in her chest tighten. She didn't share his calm acceptance. To her, this wasn't fine. It was far from it. She glanced around the cabin, wondering if anyone else had noticed. Most passengers were absorbed in their own worlds, reading, sleeping, or scrolling through their phones. If they had seen what she had, they gave no sign. Sarah sat back, her fingers drumming lightly on her armrest. She didn't know what she would do yet, but she knew she couldn't let it go. The silence, the complacency, it was as much a part of the problem as the act itself. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The flight was long, and there would be another opportunity. For now, she waited, watching and listening, the weight of the moment settling heavily between them. The flight continued in quiet monotony, the kind that often accompanies long journeys at 35,000 feet. Passengers adjusted their seatbacks, flipped through in-flight magazines, or dozed with their headphones on. For Nathaniel Brooks, however, the stillness held an edge, subtle but unshakable. He glanced at the call button above his seat but didn't press it. He had already asked twice. To press the button now felt too much like a demand, and he had spent a lifetime avoiding the label of difficult. Across the aisle, Sarah Miller was not so easily deterred. She had been watching the situation unfold with growing unease. The flight attendant's repeated dismissals had been polite on the surface. But there was a sharpness beneath the veneer. A quiet kind of exclusion that felt both familiar and infuriating. She shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking between Nathaniel and the crew bustling at the front of the cabin. The water had yet to arrive. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice steady but firm. She leaned slightly into the aisle as the flight attendant passed again. The young woman stopped, her smile polite but faintly strained. "Yes," the attendant replied, tilting her head. Sarah gestured toward Nathaniel. "I believe this gentleman has been waiting for a glass of water. He asked quite some time ago." The attendant blinked, caught off guard. "Oh," she said quickly. "I'll take care of it right away." Her smile returned, wider now but no less rehearsed. And she hurried toward the galley. Nathaniel turned to Sarah, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice steady but touched with weariness. "It's nothing," Sarah replied, though her tone carried a weight that suggested otherwise. "You shouldn't have to keep asking." Nathaniel offered her a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes you do," he said, his words simple but layered with meaning. Minutes passed, and the water still didn't come. Sarah watched as the flight attendant moved through the cabin, tending to other passengers, her pace unhurried. A knot of frustration tightened in Sarah's chest. She glanced at Nathaniel, who sat with the quiet patience of someone who had endured far worse. It wasn't resignation, exactly, but something close to it, a calm acceptance of a pattern too deeply ingrained to be easily altered. Sarah took a breath, steadying herself. She leaned into the aisle again, catching the flight attendant's eye as she passed. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her tone firmer this time. "I don't mean to be rude, but this is the second time I've had to remind you about the water." "Is there a problem?" The attendant froze briefly, her professional demeanor slipping just enough to reveal a flash of irritation. "I was just about to get it," she replied, her tone clipped. "We're very busy." Sarah held her gaze, unflinching. "I understand that," she said calmly, "but everyone else seems to have been served without issue." The air between them tightened, heavy with unspoken tension. The attendant forced a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll get it now," she said, her voice low, and turned sharply toward the galley. Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured, his tone quiet but firm. "Yes, I did," Sarah replied, her gaze steady. "It's not right." Nathaniel sighed, the sound soft and resigned. "It's not new, either," he said after a moment, his voice carrying the weight of years. "You learn to choose your battles." Sarah looked at him, her expression a mix of empathy and determination. "Maybe," she said, "but this isn't a battle you should have to fight." The flight attendant returned moments later with a glass of water, her movements brisk and her expression neutral. She placed it on Nathaniel's tray without a word and moved on quickly, as though eager to put the moment behind her. "Thank you," Nathaniel said, his voice calm and unhurried, though the attendant was already out of earshot. Sarah watched her retreat, her jaw tightening. She knew the moment had passed, but the tension lingered, unspoken and unresolved. She leaned back in her seat, her gaze flicking to Nathaniel, who sipped his water quietly, his expression unreadable. The flight resumed its rhythm. But for Sarah, the hum of the engines felt louder now, the air heavier. She couldn't stop thinking about the smallness of the moment and the largeness of what it represented. It wasn't just about a glass of water. It never was. The cabin settled once more into a familiar rhythm. The flight attendants resumed their duties, moving between rows with trays of drinks and snacks. Most passengers seemed oblivious to the earlier exchange, their attention fixed on books, movies, or the quiet hum of their own thoughts. But Sarah Miller couldn't let it go. Her eyes followed the attendants, watching their practiced smiles and efficient movements. Each gesture, each word, seemed calibrated for ease and comfort. Yet the warmth didn't feel evenly distributed. Nathaniel Brooks sat beside her, his posture calm but deliberate, as though he were bracing himself for something. He took another sip of water, his expression unreadable. For him, The matter appeared settled, but Sarah could see the tension in his hands. The way his fingers gripped the plastic cup just a little too tightly. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the quiet between them. Nathaniel glanced at her, offering a faint smile. "I've been worse," he said simply. Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. The answer was both reassuring and troubling. She leaned back in her seat, her thoughts heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. She wondered if she had done the right thing by speaking up. Part of her felt certain she had. Another part questioned whether her actions had helped or merely drawn unwanted attention to a man who clearly preferred to avoid it. Not far away, the flight attendants gathered near the galley, their voices low but animated. Though Sarah couldn't make out their words, she could sense the tension in their body language, the quick glances toward her row, the slight edge in their laughter. One of them, the woman who had finally brought Nathaniel's water, glanced her way, her expression tight with something between annoyance and discomfort. Sarah tried to ignore it, but the weight of their stares lingered. She shifted in her seat, feeling the burn of their judgment even in its silence. For the first time, she understood a fraction of what Nathaniel must have experienced. Not just on this flight but throughout his life, a constant, quiet scrutiny that seemed to question his place in spaces others occupied so easily. Nathaniel must have noticed her unease because he spoke again, his voice low and steady. "You didn't have to stick your neck out for me," he said, not unkindly. "I know," Sarah replied, "but I couldn't just sit there." He studied her for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "That kind of courage is rare," he said, "but it's not always welcome." Before Sarah could respond, a voice cut through the cabin. "Miss, can I speak with you for a moment?" It was one of the senior flight attendants, a man with a neatly pressed uniform and an air of authority. He stood in the aisle, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah glanced at Nathaniel, who gave her a small nod, as if to say it was her choice. She unbuckled her seatbelt and rose, following the man to the galley. The area was small, cramped with trays and equipment, but the attendant's posture made it clear this was a formal space now, one meant for addressing grievances. "I understand there was an issue earlier," he began, his tone measured. "I just wanted to ensure everything has been resolved." Sarah folded her arms, meeting his gaze evenly. The issue was that a passenger was ignored multiple times after making a simple request. She said, "It shouldn't have taken that much effort to get him a glass of water." The attendant's smile tightened, a flicker of defensiveness crossing his face. "We're very busy during service," he replied. "Sometimes things get overlooked." "It's not personal." "It felt personal," Sarah countered, her voice calm but firm. "And it wasn't just me who noticed." The man's jaw tightened, but he maintained his professional tone. "We strive to treat all passengers equally," he said. "I'm sorry if it didn't appear that way." Sarah held his gaze, searching for sincerity in his words. She found little. "It didn't," she said, "and I think you know that." The attendant exhaled sharply, his composure slipping just enough to reveal his frustration. "I'll pass your feedback along," he said curtly. "Thank you for bringing it to my attention." Sarah returned to her seat, her thoughts heavy. Nathaniel didn't ask what had been said, and she didn't offer. The silence between them was companionable but fraught, each of them turning over their own thoughts. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, at least on the surface. But the atmosphere felt different now, charged with an unspoken tension. Sarah noticed the glances from other passengers, the way some looked at her with quiet approval while others seemed uncomfortable, even disapproving. It was as if her small act of defiance had unsettled the fragile equilibrium of the cabin. Nathaniel leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes as though to sleep. But Sarah could tell he wasn't resting. His hands remained tightly folded in his lap, his breathing measured but shallow. She wanted to say something, to reassure him, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, she sat quietly beside him, sharing the weight of the moment in silence. The hum of the airplane engines persisted, a steady backdrop to the quiet tension that had settled over the cabin. Sarah Miller shifted in her seat, her fingers tracing the edge of the armrest as she tried to focus on the view beyond the window. Clouds stretched endlessly, soft and unbroken, But the serenity outside only deepened the unrest within. She could still feel the weight of the conversation in the galley. The hollow apology that did little to address what she had seen and felt. Nathaniel Brooks remained composed beside her, his hands resting lightly on his lap. His face betrayed none of the unease Sarah felt. But his silence seemed heavier now. Deliberate. It wasn't resignation. Sarah realized it was restraint. He had chosen to remain quiet. Not because he hadn't noticed the injustice, but because he had noticed it too many times to count. The murmurs began slowly, soft whispers drifting from rows nearby. Sarah couldn't make out every word, but she caught enough. Overreacting. Making a scene. Just water. She turned her head slightly, catching the disapproving glances of a man 2 rows ahead and the tight-lipped expression of a woman across the aisle. Their faces were polite masks, but their eyes spoke of discomfort. A wish for everything to return to normal, or at least their version of it. Sarah inhaled deeply, letting the air fill her lungs before exhaling slowly. She had spoken up, and now the room, or rather, the cabin, was divided. Some passengers avoided looking in her direction, their silence a choice. Others met her gaze briefly, offering faint nods of support before looking away. The division was unspoken but palpable, an invisible line running through the narrow rows of seats. From behind, a voice rose, cutting through the low hum of conversation. Why does everything have to be about race? It belonged to a middle-aged man. His tone exasperated but measured enough to avoid outright confrontation. Sarah turned slightly, meeting his gaze. His expression was one of annoyance. But there was curiosity too, as though he genuinely wanted to understand, or at least wanted his frustration validated. It's not about race, Sarah said evenly, her voice calm but firm. It's about fairness. The man scoffed lightly, shaking his head. Fairness? It was just a glass of water. People forget things. It doesn't mean it's intentional. Nathaniel shifted beside her, his posture straightening slightly. He didn't speak, but his presence was a quiet statement in itself. Sarah glanced at him briefly before turning her attention back to the man. It's not about the water, Sarah said. It's about the pattern. He asked, and he was ignored. Twice. That's not forgetting, that's choosing. The man frowned, leaning back in his seat as if to distance himself from the conversation. You're reading too much into it, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Another voice joined the discussion, this time from a row closer to the front. Maybe she's not, said a woman in her 50s. Her tone measured but thoughtful. She turned in her seat, addressing the cabin at large. I saw it too. The way they smiled at some people but not others. It wasn't overt, but it was there. This sparked a ripple of murmurs. A few passengers nodding while others stiffened in their seats. The conversation, once confined to whispers, was now spilling into the open. An uneasy dialogue that touched a nerve in everyone present. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice low but steady. Sometimes, it's easier to ignore what's uncomfortable, he said, but that doesn't make it right. The cabin fell quiet for a moment, his words lingering in the air like a shared weight. The man who had spoken earlier shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding Nathaniel's. Sarah felt a swell of quiet admiration for the older man beside her, not for his calmness, but for the depth of his restraint. The way he chose his words with the precision of someone who understood their cost. The senior flight attendant approached, his expression neutral but his posture tense. Is everything all right here? He asked, his voice carefully modulated. Nathaniel looked at him directly, his gaze steady. Everything's fine, he said. We were just having a conversation. The attendant hesitated, his eyes flicking between Nathaniel and Sarah. If there's anything you need, please let me know, he said finally, retreating without waiting for a reply. As the attendant walked away, Nathaniel leaned back in his seat, his hands returning to their resting place on his lap. People don't like to be reminded of the things they'd rather not see, he said softly, almost to himself. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the back of the seat in front of her. She thought of the man who had questioned her earlier, the quiet disapproval in his tone. She thought of the woman who had spoken up, the hesitant solidarity in her words. The cabin was a microcosm, A reflection of a broader world where conversations like these were rarely comfortable but always necessary. The hum of the engines filled the silence that followed. But it felt different now, heavier. More charged. Sarah glanced at Nathaniel, who had closed his eyes again. His expression peaceful but far from indifferent. She wondered how many moments like this he had endured in his lifetime and how many more would come. She wondered, too, if her small act of speaking out had made any difference at all. The flight continued, the miles rolling by unseen beneath them. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in the cabin, but in herself. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants prepared for the evening portion of the journey. A sense of calm had returned. Or at least the semblance of it. Passengers spoke in hushed tones or leaned back in their seats, some drifting off into light sleep. Yet beneath the surface, the air felt thick, heavy with the residue of unresolved tension. Sarah Miller couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation had left an imprint. A crack in the carefully maintained veneer of civility. Nathaniel Brooks sat beside her. His eyes closed, his breathing slow and even. Sarah wondered if he was truly resting or simply choosing silence as a refuge. She admired his composure, though it troubled her as well. It wasn't the kind of calm born from ease, it was the calm of someone who had learned, over decades, to bear the weight of moments like these without breaking. A rustle behind her drew Sarah's attention. A man in a crisp suit had risen from his seat in the first-class cabin and was walking down the aisle. His stride was unhurried but purposeful, his presence commanding without being imposing. He stopped near Nathaniel's row, pausing to glance at him before turning to Sarah. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low and measured. "Would you mind if I sat here for a moment?" Sarah hesitated, unsure of his intent, but Nathaniel opened his eyes and gestured for the man to take the aisle seat. "Please," Nathaniel said, his tone calm but curious. The man settled into the seat, smoothing his tie before leaning slightly toward Nathaniel. "I couldn't help overhearing earlier," he began, his words deliberate, "and I felt it was important to say something." Nathaniel studied him quietly, his expression unreadable. "Go on," he said. The man nodded, glancing briefly at Sarah before continuing. "My name is Gerald Johnson. I'm an attorney," he said, his voice steady, "and I've spent much of my career addressing issues of equity, racial, economic, social." What I witnessed earlier, while subtle, was not unfamiliar. Sarah felt a flicker of relief. Gerald's words carried a weight of authority, a careful balance of empathy and professionalism. She glanced at Nathaniel, whose expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained sharp. "It wasn't about the water," Gerald continued, his tone low but firm. "It was about something deeper, something systemic. The kind of treatment that often goes unnoticed because it's woven so seamlessly into everyday interactions. But it shouldn't go unnoticed. And it certainly shouldn't go unchallenged." Nathaniel nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "You see it clearly," he said. "Not everyone does." Gerald smiled faintly. "It's hard not to, once you've lived long enough or if you've been paying attention. But calling it out, as this young lady did," he nodded toward Sarah, "that takes courage. More courage than many realize." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, both from the compliment and the weight of the moment. "I just did what anyone should do," she said, her voice quiet. "Should," Gerald agreed, "but often don't." He turned his attention back to Nathaniel. "I wanted to thank you, sir, for your grace, and to let you know that what happened here won't stay here. If you're willing, I'd like to help ensure this airline takes accountability." Nathaniel's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes but carried genuine gratitude. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "and I believe you mean it." "I do," Gerald replied, "and I've seen how even small moments like this can lead to meaningful change if they're not ignored." The conversation continued quietly, the three of them exchanging words that felt heavier than the hum of the engines around them. Gerald's presence seemed to shift the energy in the cabin. A few passengers nearby leaned slightly forward, pretending not to eavesdrop. Even the flight attendants, who had largely avoided eye contact with Sarah and Nathaniel since the earlier confrontation, appeared more subdued, their movements less assured. As Gerald rose to return to his seat, he placed a hand lightly on Nathaniel's shoulder. if you decide to pursue this. He said. Here's my card. He slid a small rectangle of thick paper onto Nathaniel's tray table. You're not alone in this. Nathaniel nodded, the gesture small but significant. Thank you, he said simply. Gerald smiled and stepped away, disappearing back into the first-class cabin. For a moment, silence filled the space between Sarah and Nathaniel. A quiet acknowledgement of what had just occurred. Do you think it will make a difference? Sarah asked softly, breaking the stillness. Nathaniel turned to her, his expression thoughtful but kind. Change doesn't come easily, he said, but it comes. Sometimes. All it takes is for someone to notice and to care enough to act. Sarah nodded, his words settling deep within her. She looked out the window. The endless expanse of clouds glowing faintly in the dim light. The world below seemed distant. Yet the issues they had faced on this flight felt achingly close. Woven into the fabric of every moment. Nathaniel leaned back, closing his eyes once more. This time, his posture seemed more relaxed. As though a small burden had been lifted. Sarah remained awake, her mind restless but resolute. She didn't know what would come next. But she felt certain of one thing. The conversation they had started would not end here. The plane began its descent. The cabin filling with the familiar sounds of passengers stowing their belongings and fastening seatbelts. The once tense atmosphere had softened but not entirely dissipated. The earlier events lingered, unspoken but palpable, like a faint echo reverberating through the narrow aisles. Sarah Miller glanced at Nathaniel Brooks, who sat quietly, gazing out the window. His expression was calm, but Sarah could sense the undercurrent of thought behind his composed demeanor. As the plane touched down, a gentle bump signaling their arrival, a ripple of relief moved through the cabin. Yet for Sarah, the landing marked not an end but a beginning. She felt the weight of unfinished business pressing against her. A quiet insistence that something still needed to be done. She wasn't sure what, but the feeling was unmistakable. The passengers filed out row by row. A slow procession of tired travelers eager to move on. Sarah waited, allowing others to pass, before rising and helping Nathaniel with his carry-on bag. He offered her a small smile, a gesture of gratitude, but his silence remained steady. When they reached the gate, Gerald Johnson was waiting. He stood near the terminal exit, his posture relaxed but watchful. He approached Nathaniel with the same quiet assurance he had shown earlier. His presence drawing the attention of nearby staff. Mr. Brooks, Gerald said, extending a hand. I wanted to ensure you were met properly before you left the airport. Nathaniel shook his hand firmly, his expression softening. You didn't have to do that, he said. It's my privilege to, Gerald replied. He glanced briefly at Sarah, offering her a nod of acknowledgement. You both handled yourselves with grace back there. I just wanted to make sure the airline understands the importance of what happened. At that moment, a woman in a crisp uniform approached. Her expression carefully composed. She introduced herself as a representative of the airline and extended her hand first to Gerald. Then to Nathaniel. Her tone was polished, her words rehearsed. On behalf of the airline, I'd like to extend our apologies for any inconvenience or misunderstanding during your flight. She said, we take all concerns seriously and will be reviewing this matter internally. Sarah felt the weight of the words but also the hollowness beneath them. They were the kind of statements meant to placate, not resolve. Gerald, however, didn't let the moment pass unchallenged. With respect, he said, his voice calm but firm. An apology is a start. But what's needed is action. I'd like to know what concrete steps your airline plans to take to ensure equitable treatment for all passengers. The representative hesitated, her composure faltering slightly. We're committed to fairness and equality, she replied. We'll be conducting additional training for our staff and implementing measures to address unconscious bias. Gerald nodded slowly, his gaze steady. Good. I'll be following up to ensure those measures are enacted. The conversation ended politely but pointedly, the airline representative retreating with a promise to follow up. Gerald turned back to Nathaniel and Sarah, his expression thoughtful. Small steps, he said, but steps nonetheless. Nathaniel nodded. It's something, he said, and something can grow. As they moved toward the terminal exit, Sarah found herself walking beside Gerald. "Do you think it'll actually change anything?" she asked. Her voice low. Gerald glanced at her, his expression steady. "Change takes time," he said. "But it starts with moments like this, with people like you who refuse to stay silent." His words settled deeply within her, resonating in a way that felt both grounding and inspiring. Sarah glanced back at Nathaniel, who was walking quietly, his gait steady despite the long day. She wondered how many moments like this he had endured, how many steps he had taken toward change in a world that often resisted it. As they reached the airport's bustling main terminal, Nathaniel paused and turned to Sarah. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Not everyone would have done what you did." Sarah smiled, a quiet warmth spreading through her. "It was the right thing to do," she said simply. Nathaniel nodded, his expression unreadable but kind. "It always is," he said, "even when it's not the easy thing." The three of them parted ways shortly after, each stepping into the flow of the terminal's constant motion. Yet Sarah carried the moment with her. The quiet power of standing together, of speaking up when it mattered. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand scheme of a complicated world, but it felt significant nonetheless. And as she walked toward the exit, the weight she had felt earlier began to lift, replaced by a quiet determination that this wouldn't be the end of her story or of Nathaniel's. Change might come slowly, but it would come, one step, one voice, one moment at a time. The airport terminal was alive with movement, passengers rushing to catch connections, families reuniting with smiles and embraces, and weary travelers navigating their way toward exits. Nathaniel Brooks stood quietly near the baggage claim, his hands resting lightly on the handle of his suitcase. Around him, the world moved with a rhythm that felt both familiar and distant. It was a rhythm he had observed all his life, one that often overlooked people like him. Sarah Miller lingered nearby, watching the steady stream of faces pass by. She had planned to leave as soon as they reached the terminal, but something kept her rooted in place. It wasn't just her concern for Nathaniel or her admiration for Gerald Johnson's steadfastness. It was the sense that this moment, a small act of resistance against an entrenched pattern, deserved her full attention until the very end. Gerald appeared again, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. He carried a quiet energy, his every movement purposeful yet unhurried. When he reached Nathaniel, he extended a hand once more. "Before we go our separate ways," Gerald began, "I wanted to make sure you have everything you need. My office will be in touch with the airline, and I'll personally see to it that this doesn't get swept under the rug." Nathaniel nodded, his gratitude evident but subdued. "Thank you," he said simply. "It means something to know that someone cares enough to act." Gerald smiled faintly, his expression softening. "The fight isn't new," he replied, "but it's always worth fighting." Nathaniel looked down briefly, his fingers tightening around his suitcase handle. "It's tiring, though," he admitted, "always having to prove that your experience is valid, that your voice matters." Gerald placed a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "That's why we stand together," he said, "because no one should have to carry that weight alone." Nearby, Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spoken up earlier because it felt like the right thing to do. But now she realized how much that simple act meant, not just to Nathaniel but to herself. In the brief hours they had shared on the flight, she had seen a world through his eyes, one shaped by quiet battles and hard-won dignity. "I'll make sure people hear about this," Sarah said, stepping closer. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Not just what happened, but why it matters. People need to see the small things that add up to something bigger." Nathaniel turned to her, his expression soft but thoughtful. "You've already done more than enough," he said, "but if you feel called to do more, then follow that." The three of them stood together for a moment, the bustling terminal fading into the background. It wasn't a grand gesture, nor was it a dramatic conclusion. It was quiet, ordinary, and profoundly human, three people acknowledging a shared moment of truth. Eventually, they parted ways. Gerald disappeared into the flow of travelers, his briefcase in hand, his stride confident. Nathaniel moved toward the exit, his pace unhurried, his head held high. Sarah lingered for a moment longer, watching him go, before turning toward the parking lot. As she walked to her car, she thought about what Gerald had said, that the fight wasn't new but was always worth fighting. She thought about Nathaniel's quiet dignity, his ability to endure without losing his humanity. And she thought about herself. About how this small moment had changed the way she saw the world. The night air was cool and crisp as she stepped outside. Above, the stars were faint but steady, their light persistent despite the vast darkness. It felt fitting. She thought, a reminder that even the smallest lights could make a difference. Sarah started her car and pulled out of the parking lot, her mind still lingering on the day's events. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she felt certain of one thing: the story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and she was ready to be part of it.